So, hello, Patrick Hickey here from Borbury Comprehensive School, and this is my lesson on the Free State economy under the Cumann government from 1922 to 1932. So, here it is, finally. An Irish government finally has its hands on the reins of power. I suppose for a long time we would have said, or it was often said, that the Irish economy was in trouble or the way it was because of British rule or misrule. So finally now we have an Irish government that's going to take control. And I suppose it'll be interesting now to see how they get on. Well, I can tell you at this stage it's going to be a big disappointment. Now, the government that takes power in 1922 is the Cumann government, led by W.T. Cosgrave. As you can see here now, I've underlined the letter C in the word Cumann, because you can associate a lot of C words with Cumann, including caution, continuity, but above all, conservatism. For example, Kevin O'Higgins, who I mentioned a lot in my previous presentation about Cumann and state building, which I think most commentators would agree they were good at, he proudly proclaimed that Cumann were the most conservative revolutionaries in history. And I suppose the best example of this was the party's economic policy. Now, it has to be said, first of all, the government faced many problems. I suppose one of the main ones was partition. In losing Northern Ireland and cities like Belfast and Derry, the Free State had lost its industrial heartland. The Civil War had also caused a lot of infrastructural damage. For example, bridges, roads were blown up, as were railway tracks like the one pictured here. And of course, these attacks were being carried out by the anti-treaty IRA, who were doing their best to disrupt the country and this fledgling government. So, as I said, to disrupt and destabilise. Now, this is a man you need to know about. This is the Free State Minister for Finance, Ernest Blythe. He was very much guided by J.J. McGilligan. Now, J.J. McGilligan is a key personality, a rather surprising choice, but he is one. So at ordinary level, you can expect questions just on him. Now, if you are asked to talk about J.J. McGilligan, I would say just talk about Cumann economic policy, because it has all the hallmarks of him. Now, a few biographical details. He was born in 1893 in Tralee, County Kerry. He fought in the GPO in 1916. Okay, so that might lead you to believe that this man was very radical and fiery and all the rest of it. He was far from it. He seemed to calm down a lot in his older years. Now, after the Rising, I suppose after a time in prison, he went on to study economics. Proved very good and adept at it, and eventually found himself as Chief Secretary of the Department of Finance from 1927, a position he would hold for 26 years. He was extremely conservative in outlook. Had no time for John Maynard Keynes and his theories. I suppose if you'll remember, John Maynard Keynes was big into, say, if an economy is in trouble, a government should borrow. It should borrow its way out of the problem, by scrimping and saving, using austerity. That only makes things worse for the economy. McGilligan was totally against this theory, though. McGilligan and Blythe's priorities were mainly balancing the budget, meaning their government would only spend what it took in taxes. Ireland would not borrow. Borrowing, in their eyes, was a sign of failure. Okay? Basically, that the Free State wasn't able to cope without was unable to cope being independent of Britain. Now, Cumann and Blythe weren't against taxes, right? They certainly collected those, but they were against big taxes. So the wealthy would do very well under their government. I suppose the Free State government also found itself at a crossroads in terms of, now that we have independence, would we go for protectionism as recommended by Arthur Griffith, or continue free trade with Britain? What did Ernest Blythe go for? We continued free trade. Now, the likes of big industries, big companies like Jacobs and Guinness were extremely happy with this. You know, they could now trade and continue to trade their produce with Britain without the fear of tariffs. However, it was a very poor decision in terms of small industries, you know, who would find it very hard to compete with British companies, especially when they sold their products in Ireland. Who would also benefit? Well, not so much small farmers, but big beef farmers, as represented by this man here. These farmers, they would send their cattle and beef to Britain, and again do so without the fear of tariffs, again boosting their pay packet. Now, the reasons for this, as I said, agriculture was the country's main employer. It accounted for 80% of our exports. The Free State government felt it would be the engine to drive the rest of the country. In other words, if the farmers are doing well, they will spend their money. They will help the rest of the economy improve. The Minister for Agriculture was Patrick Hogan. The main measures he introduced, again to help farmers and to boost agriculture, included setting up the ACC, the Agricultural Credit Corporation, a bank set up to provide loans and credit to farmers to improve their land, buy machinery, etc. Today, I believe it's a subsidiary, or at least is owned by Rabobank, so it's still with us in a way. Hogan also adopted policies which aimed at improving the competitiveness of Irish agricultural exports in Britain. You know, so in other words, the British shopper would be happy to buy Irish products ahead of even British or Danish products, which are also popular in Britain at the time. So his Department of Agriculture set standards for production and presentation in eggs, meat and butter. He also tried to improve the quality of the Irish breeding stock. So there was a big drive put on to improve the quality of Irish bulls, you know, and consequently that would help the quality of Irish cattle. Now, the success or failure on this over-reliance on agriculture, I suppose it has to be said it was a limited success. If it benefited anyone, it benefited bigger farmers, but they were far from the typical farmer that existed in Ireland at the time. So mainly poverty continues to be a common day feature in rural Ireland. And of course the scourge of immigration continues. Now, we look at industry. Again, the Free State government pursued an extremely conservative policy. Now, I suppose there were some good reasons, namely we lacked raw materials. We just didn't have the capital or the investors who would set up large industrial companies. Plus you had competition from Britain, which was already pre-existing. Taking that on now as an independent state was not going to be easy. There was one exception to this, and that was the Ardnacrusha hydroelectric dam, also known as the Shannon scheme. Now, despite opposition from the Department of Finance, who thought it too risky and expensive to pursue, On this occasion, the Free State government took a gamble, and the project was given the green light. Now, it started in 1924. Now, I suppose in terms of planning and the larger engineering side of it, that was done by the German company Siemens at a cost of £5 million. It took 7 years to complete. Now, going back to the £5 million in terms of how big a gamble and how much money this was, it was actually 1/5 of the state's annual budget. Which, I suppose, considering the conservatism of Cumann it's astonishing in the first place that they actually went for it. But they did. The whole project provided a big boost to the local economy. 4,000 workers were taken on. And of course, those workers, they lived in the area, right? They bought food. They went to local pubs, all that helped the local economy around Clare and Limerick. So, I suppose it has to be said, John Maynard Keynes was right. Like, when governments do this kind of thing, when they actually invest in their economy, it does help everyone. And I suppose, as we saw before, when we looked at Keynes and Keynesism, this is the heart of it, that governments get involved in the economy. When it's struggling, they don't stand back. Right? That was certainly seen with the Shannon scheme. Further results, well, in 1927, the ESB was set up. This would lead to the total transformation of living and working conditions, especially in rural Ireland, with the onset of electrification. I suppose it's a great pity, considering its success, that the Free State didn't show this kind of creativity and imagination all of the time, or at least more of it. Now, when it comes to the economy, I also want to look at Cumann welfare or social welfare policy. Well, it has to be said there was little investment in healthcare, housing, or social welfare. Cumann was quite happy, and so were its successors in Fianna Fáil from 1932 on, to leave the running and management of schools, orphanages and hospitals in the hands of the Catholic Church. Now, this is something we'll return to when we look at the other case study, the one on the Eucharistic Congress. This whole idea of a duopoly of power, that alongside the elected government, you also had the power of the Catholic Church. Certainly in terms of what we're looking at here, schools, orphanages, etc. Okay, just something to keep an eye of in future. Now, Cosgrave's government became very unpopular, not surprisingly when you consider some of the measures they introduced. Now, you can ask why they would do this, but again, it all goes back to this idea of balancing the budget, balancing the books. When the economy is struggling, you take in less taxes. That means as a government you have less money to spend, and as we said already, the Free State government was not going to borrow. So some of these unpopular decisions included cutting widows and blind persons' pensions. Teachers, Gardaí and nurses also had their wages cut. So that didn't make Cumann popular, far from it. They became increasingly unpopular in the second half of the 1920s. They even reduced the old age pension by 10%, which was a shocking decision. Many saw it as an attack on our country's most vulnerable. Now, I suppose the lack of government aid and maybe heart for Ireland's poor was highlighted worst of all in Adrigole. Now, if you don't know it, Adrigole is a small village in West Cork, right, quite close to Bantry. Well, in March 1927, a family of 4 starved to death. Yes, that's 1927, not 1847. That actually happened under Cumann watch. I suppose it's a damning indictment of their government. So, an overall assessment of Cumann and Nail's economic policy. Their performance when it came to running the economy was poor. It lacked imagination. There was little progress made in agriculture and industry. Indeed, a lot of small companies went to the wall or went bankrupt because of the Free State's insistence on free trade. They just didn't have a chance against the British competitors. They can also be accused of not providing enough help and support for our country's most vulnerable. And I suppose that was worse seen when it came to the cut in the old age pension by 10% and the Adrigole tragedy of 1927. It made the government look like it didn't have one of these, a heart. The results? So, continued high rates of poverty, high unemployment, and high immigration. And I suppose what makes the situation worse is 1929 and the Wall Street crash. Now, we already saw the impact of this on countries like Germany, and how it facilitated the Nazis' rise to power. Ireland was also badly affected. And I suppose with the onslaught of Wall Street, it exacerbated the problems in Ireland, problems the Cumann and Nail government were struggling to deal with anyway. They just couldn't deal with them at all now. And I suppose it will come as little surprise that in 1932, the Cumann and Nail government were voted out of office with Fianna Fáil's victory in that year's election. They brought, as we'll see in our next video, a very different approach to running the economy. Okay, so I hope that was helpful. I hope it keeps my Leaving Certs and any other Leaving Certs that are watching these videos on track for your exams in June. Okay, so stay safe, stay well, and till next time, all the best. Bye bye.